Thanks for having us here today. You'll hear from my colleague Jay at the end of the day. But specifically, I'm going to try to open the discussion on vaccines, and then we'll hear on some more specific vaccine development projects, issues related to access to vaccines. So I'm just going to start by telling you a bit about the foundation and what we do, and then I'm going to speak about our new Access to Vaccines Index. We are an organization that conducts research on and creates incentives for pharmaceutical companies to improve their efforts to improve access to medicine in low and middle income countries. We're an independent, non-profit organization, and our funders are mentioned on this slide: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, UK Aid, the Gates Foundation, and the Vaccines Index is actually funded by the National Postcode Lottery in the Netherlands. And we take a multi-stakeholder approach to how we measure and incentivize companies. Our model for change is based on 3 pillars. So the first one relates to stakeholder consensus building. And what we do is we regularly consult with stakeholders from different areas of global health to better define and understand what to expect from industry in improving access and where industry faces important incentives and disincentives in their activities. We use the consensus that we build to develop metrics that we measure companies on, and the metrics result in some cases in a ranking, like you can see on the slide, which stimulates a race to do well in key areas in access to medicine. And another important output of these metrics is diffusion of best practices. So by looking at what companies are doing and comparing their activities, we're able to identify best practices across a variety of areas related to access and share information on what those best practices look like. And that's important for companies to learn what they're doing well and also what other companies are doing well that they can adapt. So this is just an overview of some of the outputs and tools we create. The first image on the upper left is representing the Access to Medicine Index. So this is our oldest tool, and that's been produced every 2 years for the past 10 years. And the Access to Medicine Index measures and ranks the top 20 R&D-based pharmaceutical companies based on market cap on their access to medicine activities. The most recent index was published late last year, and that was focusing on 83 metrics in access. You can also see another example is the AMR benchmark. So this is a new project we've just started working on that will focus on metrics specific to issues related to accessing antimicrobials and to preventing antimicrobial resistance. And then the other product, which I'll focus on more now, is the Access to Vaccines Index. And before I get there, I just wanted to highlight some of the uses of the tools that we create. And so the aim is that the tool would be useful for different types of stakeholders in global health, like yourselves. And some examples would be, to start with pharma companies themselves. I mentioned that they can learn about what their activities are and how they measure against certain standards in access. Also understand better what other companies are doing and try to strive towards that behavior. Some other examples, I guess, funders and global health stakeholders primarily can better understand how the industry is responding to certain global health priorities. On the investor side, socially responsible investors especially can look to our findings to understand which companies are behaving more sustainably in terms of access. So to focus a little bit on the Access to Vaccines Index, the first iteration of this index was published at the beginning of March this year. This is the first ever public tool that maps industry action specifically in access to vaccines. So it's really taking a segment of what we look at in the medicine index and zeroing in on access issues and barriers to access that are specific to vaccines. It looks at 8 companies and their efforts to improve access to preventive vaccines. And as I mentioned before, the project was funded by the Dutch National Postcode Lottery. So the scope of this research tool is looking at what these 8 companies are doing with regards to making preventive vaccines accessible. So we're looking for preventive vaccines in human use and not therapeutics. The companies that we focused on are 8 major players in the vaccine space. 4 of these are making up the largest portion of the global vaccines market by revenue, and that's GlaxoSmithKline, Merck & Co., Pfizer, and Sanofi. We also measured the behavior of Serum Institute of India, which is a really important player in the global vaccine space. both in terms of the number of doses it produces annually, but also in terms of its geographic reach. And then the last 3 companies we focused on have smaller vaccines businesses, but those businesses are expanding and increasingly facing outwardly globally. So that includes Johnson & Johnson, and we'll hear from Janssen later in the session, and it also includes Daiichi Sankyo and Takeda, 2 Japanese companies. So what we did is we measured the company's activities across targeting 69 diseases. This includes all the diseases recommended for routine immunization by WHO, but it also includes quite a long list of diseases for which no vaccines currently exist. These were selected based on stakeholder recommendation for a variety of reasons. And we're looking at the company's activities targeting specifically 107 low and middle income countries. The countries are selected, not only based on income level, but also based on inequalities. So you have the low income and lower middle income countries, but also some upper middle income countries due to high inequalities within those states. So the resulting index that we measured the companies on included 3 research areas, and these areas were identified through, as I've mentioned before, a stakeholder consensus building exercise around where companies can be expected to act in access to vaccines. So in research and development, we looked at companies' activities across 4 metrics, in pricing and registration, 3 metrics, and in manufacturing and supply, 6. And the result, in a nutshell, if you can say that, is this figure, but of course there's many more detailed analyses that we performed. And this is just showing you the overall performance of each company in each research area. The colored blocks indicate points that the companies attained on our scoring system, and the gray blocks indicate room to grow. And so importantly, you can see that companies are performing on key metrics where they are expected to in terms of improving access to vaccines in low and middle income countries, but of course there's also room to grow. And you can also see that there's diversity within the companies and how they perform in different areas. You might notice, or maybe you wouldn't have, in which case I'm pointing it out, that in research and development there are a few more companies measured, and that's because of what I mentioned earlier. So some of the companies we looked at don't have so much of a global presence on the market yet, but they have active R&D pipelines, and so we did measure them in the area of R&D, and in the future, ideally, would be able to analyze their activities in the other areas. So to finish off, I thought I would highlight one of our findings in the index. And I know you probably can't see it very well, but this is essentially the industry pipeline and portfolio mapping of the companies we measured. So it's only the 8 companies we looked at, but that does make up quite a large proportion of the activity globally. And these are the diseases we measured them against. But these are actually only the diseases where there was activity. So there's still almost the same length list of diseases where no activity was found. So the darker green shows you vaccines on the market, and the lighter green color shows you R&D projects in the pipeline. And what I want to do to sort of set the scene for the next conversations is focus on the lower portion of the graph. So this is the area where companies don't have vaccines on the market. In most cases, because there is no vaccine existing. And as I mentioned, there's also a whole list of diseases where there is no R&D activity at all, and those are also important diseases that I think have been mentioned quite a bit today. So the companies that we looked at are very little active in these areas, but there is important activity. And I think that, some of these diseases are NTDs, some of them are infections with pandemic potential, including also infections with a threat of antimicrobial resistance. And I think that we'll hear a bit about vaccines in some of these different areas from the different speakers, but they have certain things in common that I think are quite important, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about. The most obvious one is we don't have vaccines in these areas, and the barriers to innovation are very high. But I think that that's also another thing that they have in common is around the incentives to invest in R&D in these areas. So it's very difficult to innovate. The risk is quite high, and the market incentives are quite low, which means that the industry that we focus on isn't as engaged as they are in other areas of research. But I think also it goes without saying that the potential public health value is huge. And so I hope that these are some of the themes we can hear about as we talk about vaccine development in some of the specific disease areas that will be mentioned today. And just as a final note to zoom back out on the tool, I'm happy to take questions anytime today on how you might find it to be a useful tool for your work. But the contents are as follows. It includes an industry landscape. So that's not limited to what I just showed you, but a number of other analyses at the industry level. Also 3 key findings that are complemented by more in-depth research area analyses that really go into the individual metrics we looked at. We also conducted 2 cross-cutting analyses. So these cut across the different research areas. One of them was on R&D for emerging infectious diseases and implementation challenges there. And the other one was on sort of late-stage challenges challenges in late-stage R&D, and also rollout on 2 first-ever vaccines, so that's focusing on RTSS and Dengvaxia. And then the last component of the report are the company report cards. And so these really focus on the individual businesses of the companies. These are very diverse companies in terms of how they operate their vaccines businesses, and where they perform well, where they have room to grow, and also opportunities for them to ensure that growth. So thank you very much.